our children are lambs. Don't kid yourself. Satan has a plan for our children. But the good news is, so does God. How thankful I am for his instruction to Ellen White outlining the education of our children. She writes, in this time of special danger for the young, temptations surround them on every hand. And doesn't that just sound like she's writing for today? And while it is easy to drift, the strongest effort is required in order to press against the current. Every school should be a city of refuge for the tempted youth. A place, I always love this part, a place where their follies should be dealt with patiently and wisely. That was my favorite quote as a principal, because I can't tell you how many times a kid would mess up and some well-meaning person would come to me and say, just kick him out, get him out of there. That's not what our schools are about. We need to deal with them patiently and wisely and train them in what they're doing. God has established our schools as cities of refuge to protect the lambs, our children, our youth, from the roaring lion. This doesn't mean that the devil stays out of our schools. He never gives up, and he's everywhere, seeking to destroy. Students are never exempt from the need to make wise choices, but our schools provide numerous opportunities to help students develop spiritually. Classes integrate spiritual values across the curriculum. Social activities are provided that elevate rather than bring them down. Physical activities are designed to recreate, and mental development focuses on the true source of knowledge. How many of you have heard the name Dr. George Barna? Some of you have heard that. He is the directing leader of the Barna Research Group. They're a full-service marketing research company based out of Ventura, California. And they specialize in research for Christian ministries. He wrote a book entitled Transforming Children into Spiritual Champions. There are a number of startling and significant findings that cry out for our attention. He points out the importance of the spiritual dimension in every person's life. And in a series of studies, he stresses the importance of guiding our children in their choice of inviting Jesus into their hearts at a young age. I'd like to share two of his findings with you here this morning. The first one in a study that he entitled, Why Children Ages 5 to 12 Should Be Your Church's Number One Priority. He writes, why focus on this particular slice of the youth market? Because if you want to shape a person's life, whether you are most concerned about his or her moral, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, or economic development, it is during these crucial 8 years that lifelong habits, values, beliefs, and attitudes are formed. In another study, they did a large study across the United States on the probability of someone embracing Jesus as their personal Savior. And this is what he found. Ages 5 to 12, 32%. Ages 13 to 18, 4%. Adults, 6%. Barna also points out that the spiritual moorings of children are in place by the age of 9. Thus, it's extremely important that we as a church provide our children with the opportunity to accept Jesus while they're young. How thankful we can be that our Seventh-day Adventist schools join hands with our homes and our churches in this critical aspect of guiding our children into a saving relationship with Jesus. Take care of your lambs. Otherwise, where will you get your sheep from? I'm biased, but I believe that our best defense against Satan as a roaring lion is this three-way partnership. I like to think of it as a stool. A stool that has three legs, the home, the church, and the school, is going to be steady. You take one of those legs away, and it gets interesting. You take two of them away, and it's definitely going down. Look what Ellen White says to underscore the need for our churches to assist in the Christian education of our children. In the book Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students, she writes, while we should put forth our earnest efforts for the masses of people around us and push the work into foreign fields, no amount of labor in this line can excuse us for neglecting the education of our children and youth. Just a little further on down the page, she goes on, God has appointed the church as a watchman to have a jealous care over the youth and children, and as a sentinel to see the approach of the enemy and give warning of danger. But the church does not realize the situation. She is sleeping on guard. Monday through Friday, multitudes of yellow buses ply the roads, delivering students to classrooms with good teachers, with lots of remedial programs, with all sorts of learning devices. You can depend on public schools to educate our children scholastically. They may even teach the basics of healthful living and even a certain degree of morals and ethics. Music, art, and physical education are usually well presented. However, we cannot count on them to help with the most vital of all educational aspects. The public school system will not, cannot, and can never be expected to encourage the development of a Christ-like character in its students. Even when some of the teachers want to. I have public school teachers in my family. They can't. It's against the law. And you've all, of course, been listening to the news about all of the stuff that is now starting to be required for public school teachers to teach. I don't want my kids learning about that when they're in kindergarten and grade 1. Dr. Chaim Gano in the book Teacher and Child writes, teachers have a unique opportunity to counteract unhealthy influences in a pupil's early childhood. They have the power to affect a child's life for better or for worse. A child becomes what he experiences. While parents possess the original key to their offspring's experience, teachers have a spare key. They too can open up the minds and hearts of our children. I am so thankful for our Seventh-day Adventist educators in this conference that introduce our children to Jesus each and every day. In Jeremiah 13, verse 20, in the second half of that verse, it reads, where is the flock that was given to you, your beautiful sheep? As a father, my 2 daughters are the flock that God has given to me. But as a Christian, I need to look at every child and youth who sits in these pews each and every week as a member of my flock. And so how as a church do we answer the question posed in Jeremiah 13:20? Where is our flock, our beautiful sheep? If we can be real for a moment, part of the answer is determined by how we spend our money. No church has unlimited resources in facilities, in money, in staff, in volunteers. Therefore, to be most effective, it's important that a church focuses its resources and efforts where there's the highest probability of success. In the business world, we use the term targeting strategy. Where should we focus our resources and efforts for the greatest chance of success? Well, now, before you misinterpret what I'm saying, when it comes to evangelism, I am not suggesting that we pick one group and ignore all the others. But at the same time, we definitely should not ignore the group that gives us the highest probability of success. And which group is that? Well, again, according to the Barna research, only 6% of people over the age of 19 make the decision to follow Jesus. Only a 6% chance. And yet sometimes the largest percent of our budgets focus on adults. We all like a return on investment, and yet research argues that there is no group in greater need of such an investment, or one that pays greater dividends on such an investment than our children. Traditionally, the primary purpose of evangelistic efforts has been the conversion of adults. The prevailing notion is that the real evangelism that takes place in churches is defined by what we do with adults. I always get a little frustrated. Again, the bias comes out in me, but I always get frustrated when we talk about evangelism and education. They are not two separate things. Education is evangelism. It's maybe the most successful form of evangelism we have as a church. The greatest window of opportunity that we have to bring someone to the foot of the cross is when they're under the age of 19. Wouldn't you agree this is a target population that we as a church simply cannot ignore? Educating our young people for eternity must not be a secondary or peripheral effort. It needs to be primary and central. It can't be financed using leftover funds after every other need has been met. Don't get me wrong, our church has some amazing tools at its disposal for reaching our young people. Pathfinders, adventurers, Sabbath school programs, summer camp, which just kicked off up at Camp Alamisco, vacation Bible school, just to name a few. These are all critical components of our church's evangelistic efforts to reach our young people. However, the question has to be asked, where do our school-age children spend the majority of their time? Aside from 2 to 3 hours a week at church, busy evenings at home with the family that involve getting supper, doing some chores, doing some homework, hopefully leaving enough time for family worship before going to bed, our children spend 7 or more hours a day at school. And during that huge chunk of time, students who attend Adventist schools are constantly surrounded by godly teachers, positive adult role models, and peers who believe the same thing they do. Are our schools perfect? No. Will they ever be perfect? No. As a father, I always wanted to give my kids the greatest opportunity to stay in the church, and I would take anything I could get my hands on to accomplish that. My favorite story in the Bible is the story of Zacchaeus. And every year when I talk to our teachers at our first meeting of a new school year, I remind them of the story of Zacchaeus. And those who have been at Bass now are hearing the story for the 8th time. I think they roll their eyes a little bit because it's like, oh, here we go again. But I don't care. Because to me, the story of Zacchaeus sums up what Adventist education is all about. When Zacchaeus wanted to have an encounter with Jesus, what did he do? He climbed up in a tree. Now, I can't prove this scientifically, but I like to believe, and I'll find out one day, but I like to believe that that tree wasn't put there by accident. I like to believe that Jesus put that tree right where it needed to be so Zacchaeus could climb that tree that day and have an encounter with Jesus. What do we do as teachers? We plant trees in the paths of our kids. I'd love nothing more, and none of our teachers will ever do this, I'd love nothing more than to grab your kids by the scruff of the neck and throw them in the tree and force them to have an encounter with Jesus. We can't do that, and it's not our job. to do that. But our job each and every day through Bible classes, through helping a child when they're struggling with something, through mission trips, through just regular conversations. One of my favorite things, just playing sports with them. All of those things can plant trees in their paths, and then our teachers pray each and every day that one day that child will climb one of those trees and have that encounter with Jesus. That's what education, Adventist education, is all about. In the book Education, it reads, teachers do a high and noble work by cooperating with the divine purpose in imparting to young people a knowledge of God and in molding the character in harmony with His. In awakening a desire to reach God's ideal, they present an education that is as high as heaven and as broad as the universe. This education cannot be completed in this life, but will be continued in the life to come. It is an education that secures to successful students a passport from the preparatory school of earth to the higher grade, the school above. In 1990, you may have heard of it, the North American division launched a study called Value Genesis. Anybody heard of Value Genesis before? Okay. In the year 2000, they launched a second study and very creatively called it Value Genesis 2. And then in 2010, Value Genesis 3. 2020 was supposed to be Value Genesis 4, but we all know what happened in 2020, and that kind of got pushed off to the side. And they're talking about doing it again now, but hopefully it will come soon. The purpose of these Value Genesis studies were to study the faith, values, and commitment within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it provides suggestions to our homes, our churches, and our schools that we need to seriously discuss to ensure a rich faith life in its young people. And that's what always concerns me. They've done all these studies, yet I can't tell you how many churches I go to and I ask, have you heard of Value Genesis? And the vast majority of people are going, no, never heard of it. Not sure why we do all these studies and then we don't use them. Because there's some amazing data in there that we have to talk about. In Value Genesis 3, students stated that attending an Adventist school was the most significant influence in their life that helped them develop their religious faith. In fact, here were their top 10 answers. Number 1, attending an Adventist school. Number 2, a mother's faith. Number 3, school weeks of prayer. Number 4, father's faith. Number 5, grandparents' faith. Number 6, conference summer camps. 7, student weeks of prayer. 8, Pathfinders. 9, Bible teacher. 10, school Bible classes. The top 10 answers given by students across the entire North American division, United States, Canada, Bermuda, for how each of the following has helped develop your religious faith. If you look at those answers, half of them relate to school. In fact, 81% of the students surveyed said attending an Adventist school is the most important thing that helped them develop their religious faith. Patrick Johnstone, in a magazine called Rainbows of Hope, wrote, "If children's work is neglected, you lose the next generation. Ignore children and sacrifice the future." So, what can you as a church do to support Adventist education? I'd like to suggest that there are 3 things that you can do. Number 1, and probably most important, pray. Pray for the teachers. Pray for the students. It is not a job that is getting easier. It is a challenging thing with all of the influences that students and families face. It is a tough thing. I think back when I worked up in Canada to a little cartoon that sat in the business office of our school. And yet it is so true. The first half, the first top of it, showed a teacher and a parent standing on one side of the desk, and a student sitting on the other side of the desk, and the teacher and the parent were doing this. And then the next was dated 2010, and it had the teacher sitting on one side of the desk and the parent and the student doing this. It used to be that parents and teachers partnered together for the best education for their child. Now it seems awful. A lot of times the teacher is on trial when things happen instead of working together. So pray. Pray for our educators. Pray for the students in our schools. Number two, if you know of any students who would benefit from an Adventist education, encourage their families to look into it. It's hard when you're in a small community that doesn't have an elementary school or a high school. A number of our academies do have online options. We offer a boarding academy. So when you hit the high school level, there are options. Elementary is hard. Some families choose to homeschool. If you need advice on that, call my office. We'll help you with that. Even though homeschool has nothing to do with that, we'll help with us. We'll help. Okay? Also, if you know of any quality Adventist adults who want to be involved in teaching, let me know. Finding educators is harder and harder. Southern Adventist University this year graduated 4 teachers. 4. That's pretty scary. The job shortage that you hear about in the public system is very real in the Adventist system as well. And finding quality teachers. In fact, a school in Kentucky, Tennessee last year closed. They had 25 students. They couldn't find a teacher and had to close the school. How horrible is that? So we pray that that is not the case for our conference. The third thing is financially. And there are 2 ways that you can look at doing that. Number 1, I briefly mentioned it earlier, is the Worthy Student Fund. Both Bass and Hoover have a Worthy Student Fund, and that is set up for students who can't afford to attend those institutions. And people give money to help those kids be able to have that opportunity. The second you may have heard of from our president, Brian Denise, talk about is the endowments that we have set up. Bass Memorial Academy has an endowment that we started 4 years ago. In 4 years, this little conference has raised $5.3 million in an endowment to support Bass. Brian's vision is that Bass Memorial Academy will be on this earth till Jesus comes. And that's the point of an endowment, is money that will always be there to support the school. Prices keep going up, and families can't afford it. We don't want families in our conference to not be able to go to these schools because they can't afford it. We also have an elementary endowment as well. So we have one for Bass, and we have one for our elementary schools to try to ensure that when you read about Adventist schools closing, you're not hearing about that in the Gulf States Conference. Just to wrap up, Seventh-day Adventist education has had a central place in our denomination since the year 1863. To lose that commitment, in my opinion, in my biased opinion, would have a negative effect on the foundation of Adventism. As we move forward, I believe that recommitment is imperative. So ask yourself this question. If I were the enemy, where would I put my energy? Any formidable enemy, if deciding to focus on destroying another, is going to place their energy where it would do the most damage. When it comes to destroying our church, the youth would certainly be the enemy's target population. Satan has great plans for the children and the youth in our church. He has made them a priority. Just look around you. Look at all the stuff that kids have to deal with today that you and I didn't have to deal with when we were growing up. I am so thankful I grew up at a time where my entire life wasn't on social media for everybody to see. It isn't hard to see how much of a priority God has made our children. And so this morning I want to invite each of you to remember the mission and what I believe is the non-negotiable commission that God has given to each one of us. We are shepherds. We have a flock to care for. Christian education is a vital part in fulfilling that gospel commission. Satan has placed our children on the endangered species list. We must take heed so they do not appear on the extinct species list. Church, take care of your lambs. Otherwise, where will the sheep come from in the future to fill these pews?